Well, thank you. Well, good to see you all again. Familiar faces mostly, and lovely to have new ones as well. Just to refresh for those of you who haven't actually been before or have missed one or two, we've been doing on the last two occasions, we've been looking at two of the sort of contradictions which arise from thinking about Jesus as God and man in relation to the cross. The first time we looked at whether the cross exhibited Jesus' love for mankind, or whether in this God suffered too, or whether the cross was more about justice and Jesus was offering his life back to God so others could go free. It's quite a different view of the cross. In this scenario, God is more detached from the suffering which Jesus undergoes on our behalf. And that was the first one, about love and justice. And Genevieve very wisely said maybe it's a combination of both. And I think what we're coming to recognize is that maybe we have to hold these things in tension. This week, we're going to look further at the cross and ask the question as to whether Jesus went freely and voluntarily to his death, or whether he was walking along some preordained path which God had chosen for him since his birth. As in previous weeks, we're going to start with some reflections on a verse of the hymn, My Song is Love Unknown, of which John's book is set. And then we're going to read together three extracts from chapter 3 of Love Unknown and discuss these together. And then I'll then come out, we'll have a discussion of those three extracts, and then I'll offer a little teaching on the issue. So that will then hopefully lead to further discussion and questions. And then we're going to end by reflecting again on the verse of the hymn. So let's, without further ado, start rather predictably. I've got my sound done this time, Father Christopher. So I hope, let me just put it up. Of all things, hang on, my PowerPoint has disappeared, even though it was there. Just wait for me to do that. It'll come. All right, there we go. Oh, it's such a fiddle, isn't it, trying to get this to work. No, it's not showing. Sorry, my PowerPoint isn't showing where it should show to actually put it on the... I have no idea why this is the case. Just wait for me. The PowerPoint is open, but it won't... Oh, it's come. Right, there we go. That panic when you think, what is going on here? Right, let's start the actual... Here we go. So a Lent course based on John's Love Unknown. And what we start with is just reflecting together, this time on the next verse of the hymn. Sometimes they strew his way and his sweet praises sing, resounding all the day, hosannas to their king. Then crucify is all their breath, and for his death they thirst and cry. So obviously today we're going to be thinking about the hosanna and crucify, the balance between these two. We spoke a little bit about that last week, how Jesus entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday to the sound of hosannas, which means Lord save us. And then again, 5 days later, the same crowds apparently, some of them anyway, shout crucify. And it's this contrast between hosanna and crucify, which encourages us to think a little bit more about why Jesus went to his death. So let's listen now to this verse being sung. In Love Unknown, chapter 3, John Barton makes much of whether the cross was a foregone conclusion. Was Jesus born to die on this cross, he asks? Was Jesus a free agent in going to the cross? Or were the wheels of fate just forcing him forwards? So in this session, we're going to consider the importance of free will, initially for Jesus, but it also has implications for us. In doing so, we also have to consider the issue of determinism, whether everything for Jesus, and indeed therefore perhaps also for us, was simply foreordained. So I'm now going to show you these three extracts. I'll read them, it's easier, I suppose, because I can't see any of you out there, so I'll just read them to you. You'll find them in chapter 3. I'm sure you can look at your book and discover where I've taken it from. Jesus was in one obvious sense a man of destiny, but destiny should not be taken to imply fate or necessity. Jesus strikes us as very human indeed. His destiny, if that is the right word, was not something that obliterated all the everyday activities of life, but a context which made them all take on a new importance. There was no way of being God's love in our world except by being caught in the web of accidental encounters, the constraints of a daily physical life, and the need for a social and domestic life that belong inseparably to the human condition. So, a man of destiny. We'll think further about that shortly. Here's the second one. There have been Christian schemes of thought which have seen the events of Jesus's life as foreordained by God, eliminating all chance and randomness. But the Bible, taken by and large, does not support this way of thinking. The story it tells is full of muddle, inconsequential in places, and with surprises on every page. The life of Jesus is no exception to this. The human vocation is to live through all these unpredictabilities with a consistent purpose and a consistent character. And that vocation, Jesus, as we see him in the Gospels, embraced to the full. God's involvement in Jesus is an acceptance of all this arbitrariness. So I think you can see again the idea of the unpredictabilities that Jesus had to face. It wasn't all just a neat, clear plan from beginning to end. And the third extract from the book, from that chapter 3. Christians do believe that the creation is not of control by God, but the control is not so tight that accidents cannot occur. What God did in Jesus was not to pull all the strings himself, but to be on the receiving end of arbitrariness and unpredictability. The crowd which welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem might not have turned against him. It was not fated to do so. Christians have not been good at grasping this arbitrariness in the story of the Lord's suffering and death. It sounded too like saying God was not in control. But unless we do grasp it, we shall always run the risk of worshipping a God who did not quite share our humanity, but always held something, indeed the most crucial thing, back. Okay, that's the actual demonstration of the PowerPoint for you for now. So let's just look at these three things that we're meant to be seeing here. Jesus, in one obvious sense, a man of destiny. And I think probably the first question to ask is, what is the difference between destiny and fate? John makes the point, destiny should not be taken to imply simply fate or necessity. So what is he getting at? Why is he making this distinction between destiny and fate? That's my first question. If I haven't got an answer, so I'm hoping one of you might be able to try and give me one. So just put your hand up or put the gestures on the screen if you'd like to say something. Very happy to. What is he getting at? Destiny or fate? What's the difference? Anybody like to think of that? It's a hard one, perhaps. Well, let me have a go. I mean, I think what John is possibly saying is that in some ways, yes, of course, Jesus was actually not quite born to die. I think that's the thing at the beginning of the chapter that John doesn't like that expression. But actually, there is a sense in which the cross, if Jesus is going to accept the rejection and the sense that others cannot accept it, particularly the religious leaders cannot accept his message and his description of himself as the Son of God, that Jesus is bound to die in one sense. But fate that really implies he had no choice in it whatsoever. So I think when I talk later, I'll try and steer between those two things. So my second question, I hope this is a bit easier one, is why is it important for us to know that Jesus had some free will as he faced the cross? Why, why not simply say total fate? What's the point of stressing the Jesus's free will? Anybody like to? Alex, thank you for rescuing me.
I suppose this is one of those great sort of ultimate questions, really, about why free will, why do humans have free will if indeed we do have free will, and how it works with the idea of an omnipotent God. But there's not really a point to being in the world such as we are if we don't have a choice, and if Christ didn't share in that choice, in that, I think John called it, is it the contingency of life?
Yes, yeah,
then
yeah.
There's no point really
Yes,
to the
yes.
incarnation, or indeed any point to us having reached this age of evolution, whatever.
Yeah. It's Jesus's involvement in all aspects of our humanity. I think that John is keen to show that he is as truly human as he is divine. And if we take away a little bit of the things which are human in our lives, then we take away the things that are human in Jesus's life too. No, that's helpful, Alex. No, thank you. Anybody like to offer any other comments about that first quote? I mean, I'm hoping you've got it in your books. I've got the older book, so my page numbers are slightly different. But I hope you've got it there to look at. But the date, Jesus involved in every aspect of life. Anybody want to say anything else? There's plenty of opportunity later if you want. Genevieve, yes, carry on. Thank you. I couldn't see you.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, when I was reading, because I've always been taught that it is fate and it was all predetermined. That's how I've sort of understood it. So this book is quite an eye-opener for me. And certainly reading that chapter, it did make Jesus feel more human to me, even just reading that idea. And then I sort of realized that actually, if you do accept that it was fate, then that does remove quite a lot of his humanity. And I hadn't really noticed that until the sort of the alternative was put to me. And I suddenly thought, oh yes, that does make him more relatable, more human in the fuller sense. So yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I mean, obviously, as I'll be talking about later, if we take away too much of the idea that Jesus has got some sort of destiny, we take away the divine side. So we're trying to hold together this incredible paradox between his humanity, his fully sharing our humanity, and his fully sharing our divinity. I'm sorry, that was an absolute. He's not fully sharing our divinity. He's having the divinity that we do not share. Sorry, that went completely wrong. So let's look at the second quote about Christians. Certainly cannot believe that this is where he's trying to back up his argument that creation is not out of control by God. In other words, we have think of the sentence that's a little bit later about God in Jesus not pulling strings for himself, but being on the receiving end of arbitrariness and unpredictability. And I think what he's trying to say is that creation itself has got a certain element of all the time of this in it, and God is not fully in control of creation insofar as we have wars and we have natural disasters and we have human complete sort of human what would we call it, waywardness. I was going to use sinfulness, but that's too theological. But the idea that God compromises his freedom for our sakes, but nevertheless we've got this sense, of course, ultimately his sovereignty. So let me ask you a question from this particular passage. How might the crowd not have turned against Jesus? In other words, John makes the point, the crowd might well have, the crowd that welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem might not have turned against him. So what was going on here that actually brought Jesus's destiny to its conclusion? What was happening among the crowds, or what was happening in those 5 days of the Easter week that changed the mood so much? I think this is quite a useful way of us trying to reflect on the events of Easter week. Why the move from Hosanna to crucify? Any suggestions?
Well, it's isn't it about crowd mentality? So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if people get whipped up into a frenzy, they'll follow along the majority. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
we see that time and time again in human society where
Mm-hmm.
the loudest have the most influence in some ways.
Yes.
I mean, everything that happened um, in the life and death of Jesus was politically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
you can read in divine intervention into it or not, if you want to, but it was pretty much a political
Mm-hmm.
political action, and uh, you know, through you see throughout the synoptic gospels, Jesus continually pushing the boundaries of the law, the Pharisaic law,
Mm-hmm.
and the Jewish crowds pushing back against it. You see that when Jesus healed on the Sabbath, you know, people in the magisterium, if you like, the religious hierarchy objecting to his actions, and this all culminated in this final political week,
Mm-hmm.
which is Holy Week. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's you know, you could say that it's a divine process, but it's ultimately a political process as well.
Yes.
For- and the crowds just sort of join in with this,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I suppose mimesis type thing. You know, so it's a copying. They're
Yeah.
copying each other. They're
Yeah.
following the loudest voices, I guess.
And yeah, I totally agree, because I think they possibly interpreted the entry into Jerusalem on the donkey as a political move. Hosanna, Lord save us, and addressed sort of to a messianic figure that he was going to take them from the yoke of Rome. And of course,
Sure.
Holy First is going to the temple and have a complete confrontation with the religious leaders there, and makes no attempt at all to do what they were expecting him to do, to confront the leaders. And he's got all these magical powers, surely who could bring them to bear. So I think there's that, yeah, growing disappointment too, that is not fulfilling what they wanted. So, and you could argue in that sense, it's inevitable that the crowd went against him, but in another sense, it's also such a shock to read Palm Sunday and then to read Good Friday, and to think the sheer change in momentum is just extraordinary. Let's look at the final quotation. Now, John, you know, John doesn't mince his words, and we happen to agree with him. I don't know whether I'll ever watch this recording, but I don't mind him knowing when I say that. He'd be very pleased to have, you know, somebody who's willing to take him on. But he talks about the story being full of muddle, inconsequential in places, and with surprises on every page. And the life of he's talking the story of the Bible, that is, and the life of Jesus is no exception to this. Is that how you read it? Full of muddle, inconsequential, surprises on every page. What is he getting at here? Why is he trying to help us see that Jesus's life is in some ways quite like ours in that respect? Or do we not read it as such? Do we read it all? Of course, we're caught because we are reading it through the selection of the stories from the gospel writers. So there are many other things which possibly were inconsequential and full of muddle that they don't record. But I just wonder whether you agreed with that we have, for Jesus to be fully human, he has to actually take the muddle of our lives as well. Is that sound? Is that something we can accept?
Hello, can
Yes,
I?
Bridget, sorry, I was looking down. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Firstly, I've completely forgotten how to use the raise your hand gesture, so apologies. So after
just pick
this,
it up.
I'm going to do a quick
So few of us
Zoom
we can do
tutorial
that
for
one.
myself. And hello, everybody. I know I'm brand new on this, so I hope you don't mind me pitching in. And I suppose the thing that I think of when it's the sense that if Jesus' life looked like a muddle to other people, I suppose the way I think of it is it's more that it's like he keeps wrong fitting them. because his kind of vision of God and God's kingdom is so different to what they expect. And so he keeps doing things that are really unexpected. You know, it's the kind of tax collectors and publicans and, you know, Mary Magdalene and so I suppose that's, when I think of it kind of being a muddle, I think it's more he's just not doing what people expect.
Yes.
And so sorry.
Go on. Yes. No, do go on, Bridget, please.
No, I think that's the way I'd look at that sort of sense of it's not predictable because it's completely fresh.
And then John goes on to say in that excerpt that the human vocation is to live through all these unpredictabilities, the people not accepting him because of the unexpectedness of his life, but the human vocation with a consistent purpose and consistent character. And so we have this sort of, it's again another paradox. There's uproar all around him, but he is utterly consistent, as we read in the Gospels, of what really has to be done. He doesn't change his message. He doesn't change his purpose. It doesn't conform to the crowd's expectations. He still goes ahead. So it's his free choice to be consistent and to determine his own fate, if you like, rather than to simply give in to the determination of his fate by others. But no, that's a really helpful point, Bridget. Thank you.
He keeps saying he's coming to fulfill the law and the prophets, and he keeps reiterating.
Yes.
And it's like they've forgotten what's the actual importance of the law and the prophets.
Exactly. No, that's a really good point. Does anyone else want to say anything further about this? I think the point has been made, but you may want to. Maggie, yes, do. Maggie, you're muted. Could you turn your mute off? No, you've done it. That's right.
Okay, thank you. Now, I was wondering, Stuart, and you may be able to answer this, but how we read Jesus' own prophecies of what will happen to him as we read them in the Gospels in light of what John is saying. And I feel very sympathetic that I don't see that being inevitable from Jesus' point of view, but I do see it being possibly inevitable, the clash between God and humankind and its sinfulness in the milieu in which he was working. But then do we assume that these prophetic passages are again something which was slightly more than human that Jesus knew, or is this the gospel writers post-hoc?
Yes. I couldn't thank you enough for that, Maggie, because it's exactly what I'm about to do in my reflection.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You couldn't have set it up for me better. That I had exactly that question. What do we do with the prophecies which seem to say it was, quote, foreordained? It was, we were expecting somebody like this to do this. And as Bridget said, he doesn't do it exactly as they were expecting. So that's where the muddle comes in. But nevertheless, these prophecies are an issue which seem to talk about foreknowledge and predetermination. So can I now go to screen share and give you the reflection, and then we can talk more fully, because this is my response back to John. So just give me a minute. My internet isn't totally secured at light, and it keeps clicking out. But let me do it. See what happens. Okay. I want to offer my own take on John Barton's discussion of Jesus having complete free will, both as God and man. This is important. But note, the debate isn't really only about whether Jesus is God or man, but whether Jesus, as both God and man, had free will. It's about whether Jesus, as both God and man, accepted the constraints of our contingency, back to what Alex was saying, of suffering, of death. Again, it goes back to what we thought about in the first session, about whether God could really also suffer with us. Perhaps our understanding of free will has a personal impact on whether or not we believe that Jesus had free will. On the one hand, we all value the freedom to decide for ourselves and draw our own conclusions about what we believe. Theologically, not to have free will makes a mockery of remorse, wishing we'd done differently, and repentance, knowing we were free to act differently. It also compromises our idea of accountability and justice. Why punish someone, or why punish at all, for something we could do nothing about? Not to have free will also has ramifications about how we think of prayer. As Bishop Ambrose wrote, if God knows the future beforehand, and it must come to pass, prayer is in vain. The fact we have so many instances in the Bible of God repenting or changing his mind is also important here. As the Oxford philosopher John Lucas said, with respect to God knowing everything, God restricts his foreknowledge to give man freedom of will. So that's the sort of, on John's side, if you like, the argument for the freedom. And I'll apply it to Jesus in a minute. I'm trying to start with us, how we might sympathetically view this sort of argument. So, but on the other hand, those who believe in determinism, that everything is a foregone conclusion, would argue differently. They would say that what we thought was a personal decision was influenced by so many factors, such as upbringing, education, environment, biology, nature. And theologically, many of us will believe this compromises, indeed undermines, the utter sovereignty of God. It also compromises our idea of being called, for example, to Christian ministry, and undermines a more general sense that we have that God is in control of the decisions we make and that they were not just a random choice. Augustine was of this persuasion. He said, "Our wills have as much power as God willed they should have. God foreknows our wills and so must make us will it." Now, I've put these up deliberately because I'm quite amused, because of course, some of you will, Ambrose of Milan was actually the spiritual tutor of St. Augustine in the first instance and responsible for baptizing them. I often wonder what sort of conversations they must have had about this topic, which probably shows that even as long ago as some 1700 years, these issues were still quite hot, quite difficult to debate. In our first session, we talked about the cross as a reflection of God's love or justice. And we talked about the paradox of the cross and wondered if it was an element of both. Perhaps here we might have to come to the same conclusion. This fits with what Maggie raised a minute ago. The cross visually is such a paradox. Perhaps it shows both free will and determinism. But John Barton would argue that the primary purpose of the cross is to show us the free choice of Jesus, human and divine. Things were not predetermined, John writes. Things could have happened differently. So let's look at this a bit further. This goes back to what Maggie was asking. Does the Bible speak about Jesus' death as foreordained? An awful lot about what we read in the Gospels seems to say this was in fact the case. Jesus' death was indeed foreordained. The Gospel writers take up various Old Testament passages which speak of a coming figure who would save the Jewish people from enemy oppression, in their day from the Romans, and they see that Jesus did indeed come to save the Jewish people, but that, and this is as Bridget was saying, he also gave many of the Old Testament passages a different meaning. The problem here, and it's the one we've talked about in previous sessions, is whether many of the Old Testament passages were used, and this is the key point, were used after Jesus' death and resurrection to make sense of what had happened. In other words, did the gospel writers and Paul and the author of the Hebrews, each knowing their Hebrew Bible very well, find passages in individual verses to explain that all this had been part of God's plan? Now they have the necessary hindsight. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It's really important. There are several examples of this in Matthew's gospel, when again and again, Matthew says of Jesus, this was to fulfill that which had been spoken of old. For example, of Jesus' birth, we read, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So here is Matthew commenting on Jesus' birth as a fulfillment of earlier prophecies about a coming figure who was going to be called Emmanuel. That prophecy is actually in the book of Isaiah. Or when Jesus heals the sick, we read from Matthew, that evening they brought to him many who were possessed with demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and cured all who were sick. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. That's quite interesting. Or, now using the verse of that hymn we heard earlier, when Jesus took the donkey to ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, Matthew again says, this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, this is the prophet Zechariah, saying, tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I think what Matthew is making clear here is not coming on a war horse, he's coming on a donkey. He's coming as a king of peace. That's what actually the prophecy was about, and Jesus is fulfilling it. But, and this is the big but I want us to consider later, note that in each case, Matthew is speaking, reflecting on Jesus, not the words of Jesus himself. Prophecy is a prediction of what is to come. It does not predetermine it. Indeed, Matthew refers to some prophecies which are not in the Old Testament, and some of the Old Testament prophecies he might have used, he does not. So Matthew is selecting things as a commentary on the birth, the healings, and now the entry into Jerusalem of Jesus, as if it's only after the event he could see the divine plan. So that's a point which is important. I want to sort of counter it in a minute, but not quite yet. I want you to hold that on to that. Some of what Maggie was saying is absolutely right, but it may well be that these were made in the light of the end and looking back and trying to make sense of it from the death and resurrection. There are several examples from the book of Acts which do the same thing. Now that really is written in the light of Jesus's death and resurrection. First at Peter's speech in Pentecost, I haven't put these on, I didn't want to sort of put every verse up, but where Peter speaks, this man handed over to you, according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of those outside the law. This is Peter speaking after the death and resurrection at Pentecost. And again, Peter, that's in Acts 2, just shortly after this, in Acts 4, after he's been imprisoned, his first imprisonment, Peter says, for in this city, in fact, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. This is actually his prayer. To do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. That's Acts 4, 27 to 28. So there's certainly a recognition on the part of those who are commenting on Jesus's birth, life, death, and resurrection, that there is a pattern that's going on here, which Jesus has been fulfilling. So passages which were, seem to be written after it happened, so it still leaves open the possibility, which John Barton argues so well, that for Jesus himself, both human and divine, the actual way to the cross was one of free choice. So the big thing we have to ask ourselves is, what might we read from Scripture which suggests that Jesus indeed did have free will? And that for me is the nub of the problem, and that John raises the question, which we now have to try and answer through Scripture. What might we read from Scripture which suggests that Jesus indeed did have free will? The references I've given you before have been the gospel writers and the writer of Acts saying it from the hindsight. What about the way in which Jesus is recorded? And I thought about this a while, and I thought the best way of looking at this is by taking some of the prayers which we read Jesus prayed. Obviously, that is again through the selection of the gospel writers, but we are looking at the prayers as they remembered Jesus praying them. And one interesting example is the one that Jesus prays before the raising of Lazarus in John 11. And so they took away the stone, as Lazarus hasn't yet come out, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so they may believe that you sent me. So here we read that Jesus knows that God hears him, but he does not say that he knows God will always answer him in doing what he wants. The very act of the prayer reminds us of the saying of Ambrose, if God knows the future beforehand and it must come to pass, prayer is in vain. So now I thought what I'd do is take 3 prayers Jesus uttered in the Garden of Gethsemane and 3 prayers he uttered from the cross. Let's look at the 3 Gethsemane prayers first. I've taken them all from Matthew, but these are in all the first 3 Gospels. This is the first prayer in Gethsemane. Then he saith unto them, sorry, I've used a different translation, I didn't realize this, sorry. Then he saith to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. So the disciples are supposedly watching, you probably know, they fall asleep. And he came a little nearer and fell on his face, praying and saying, this is so crucial, isn't it? Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Sorry about the change in prose and translation, but you can get the message. And then a second prayer, after he's confronted the disciples, he goes back a second time and praying, Father, if this cup cannot pass from me, but I must drink it, thy will be done. And then a third time, and leaving them, he went away again and prayed the third time, saying again the same words. Not as I will, but as thou wilt. This is not an easy verse. Who's being addressed here? We have Jesus, human and divine, addressing God. But it seems very clear that Jesus has a free will, which at this particular moment in time, he chooses to align with the will of God. This is a free choice, and it is also an incredible example of Jesus's love freely given. So those are the three prayers in Gethsemane. Let's look at the three prayers on the cross. We all know probably that Jesus spoke the 7 words from the cross. Jesus actually speaks 7 times, as recorded throughout all four Gospels. But only 3 of these 7 words are actually prayers addressed to God. So I've chosen these 3 particular prayers. This is the first. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The prayer for forgiveness is interesting here. They know not what they do. Does not mean it was foreordained that they should behave in this way, but they acted in utter ignorance. And again, because this is a prayer, it implies the resolution is an open issue. Here's the second. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of you might know this is taken from a psalm, the first verse of Psalm 22. Originally, these were words of a prayer of a suppliant longing to experience the presence of God. Jesus takes these all too human words and turns them into a prayer to God, his own prayer to God. This has some resemblance with the prayer in Gethsemane. Although here, it's not really a prayer, more a cry of anguish from Jesus who feels God forsaken. Perhaps this is something we ought to talk about later, but there's a certain freedom of expression going on here between God the Son, the God-man, God, but God the Son addressing God the Father. And the final prayer, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. Now it's interesting, Luke deliberately does not use my God, why have you forsaken me in Psalm 22. Matthew and Mark use that. Luke does not use Psalm 22. The God-forsakenness of Jesus was something for him which seemed to be a contradiction in terms. How could God forsake God? So instead, he has Jesus. So instead, he has Jesus, God and man, freely handing over his spirit, his lifeblood, to the safekeeping of his Father. Surely this is another act of utter love, utter suffering, freely given and freely spent. So in these prayers, it seems to me that every time we see examples of fear and abandonment, yet also of commitment and trust, we have an example of Jesus freely choosing this costly and horrific work of redemption. If we see the cross as an expression of God's love for humankind, expressed in Jesus, we will probably see it as the most costly example of free will. In this case, Jesus need not have gone this far. He did it freely. But if we see the cross as an outworking of God's justice in using Jesus' death to bring humankind back to himself, we will probably see it as the most tragic example of predeterminism. In this case, Jesus had no choice but to take up the cross for us. He did it because he had no choice but to do so. See how it links with our first week. We talked about love and justice. If you really emphasize the love of God in Jesus, in giving himself on the cross, you have to go with the idea that this must in some ways be a free act of free will. If you take the idea of the cross as an outworking of God's justice, Jesus having to bring humankind back to himself, an offering, substitutional offering to God, then you see that Jesus had no choice but to do this. So I'm just going to give you a moment of quiet reflection before we actually come back to discussion and think further about this. I think that is, as far as I can do it, my answer to Maggie's question. I'm quiet as I just come out of this and we have a time just to reflect. Let me just recap what I've tried to say to you. I tried to explain how free will and determinism are elements in both our lives that we need to come to terms with. We can't pray if we don't believe we've got some aspect of free will, but at the same time, we can't actually talk about our lives as being in God's control if we don't have some sense also of that, of them being determined. And then I looked at what Maggie was asking for, the references to the prophets, the prophecies in the New Testament, which do give us a sense that things are being ordained. But the one thing I tried to stress there is that some of these examples, not all, but some of these examples do seem to be made in hindsight, explaining what Jesus has done rather than saying he's been driven forward inevitably by this. So I use those two examples from Matthew about the virgin, about Jesus' birth, the virgin conceiving and bearing a son called Emmanuel, and driving out the spirits, and the one from Palm Sunday. So that was my main point. And then I decided the best way forward was to really look at Jesus's own words and words in prayer, which do suggest an element of free conversation between God the Son and God the Father. So difficult for us. If only Rachel were here, you know, she talked about how we can't get through human language to talk about all this. It's too difficult. But I think what I tried to do was those three prayers in Gethsemane being a really important example of Jesus accepting the cup, to drink the cup on his own freely. Nevertheless, what I will, what you will, nevertheless, committing that freedom of his will to God. And also, that's why Dick is downstairs, sorry. We knew that was going to happen. And also, it's the expression of free will in Gethsemane, but the expression too through his prayers on the cross of free will. So, okay, I've tried to summarize it as best I can. It's a difficult genre, this. In some ways, I'm glad for PowerPoint because it enables me to say it more simply. But any questions, any thoughts? Is this new to you? Do you want to take, go with it a bit further? Anybody want to? Do you not think I'm right in thinking that some of these prophecies are written to explain rather than predict? Over to you.
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to these things. I think we're living with a mystery, so it's good to just discuss them. And from my point of view, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to look at these. We all come at it from a different perspective, so it's good to reflect on it together.
Maggie, have you got anything to say? You were the one who raised the question. You're probably regretting having done so.
No, I think I was feeling too that at times Jesus spoke about his end to his disciples as though it was inevitable. And I don't think that's quite the same as saying that God had put it there as part of his necessary destiny, but just that he understood perhaps where he was, what was happening, and that in a larger sense that had to be the end.
No, that's helpful.
Amanda had her hand up there.
Sorry,
Who did?
Amanda.
Oh, Amanda.
Sorry, Amanda.
Sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you, Maggie.
No, do please speak.
No, I was just thinking the way that you kind of highlighted the the prayer in Gethsemane and Jesus's own articulation of things, and you as well, Maggie, just what you said, and then the kind of prophetic or reflective, however you want to look at it, work of the gospel writers. It kind of helped me to see not attention, well, I guess the tension, like Christopher just said, about the mystery of the whole thing, and how in a way I really love that. I love that the Bible kind of gives us both and allows us to sit with that tension, because I think we have to to some
Yes,
extent.
right.
So it's kind of reassuring to me that it's not kind of neatly tied it up. That
Yes.
it kind of presents, I guess maybe that's it sort of fits
Yeah.
in with what we've been discussing with the contingency and the kind of complexity of all of these networks of, I don't know what, the free will or, whatever. But I was just thinking in terms of a kind of narrative structure, or, the kinds of things that are presented in the Gospels. I find very, I've never noticed that before, that the way. So thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to unmute?
Sue?
Yeah. Oh, well done. Great. Yes. Do.
Out of your 6 prayers, 3 of them seem to me to be very dubious evidence. Thinking of Maggie's point, because if the disciples were asleep and he continually upbraids them for being asleep, how on earth does anybody know what he was praying? Whereas the 3 prayers from the cross, presumably there are witnesses. So in some sense, they seem to me to be much better evidence than the 3 remarks when he's in Gethsemane, even though the remarks in Gethsemane really tug one's heartstrings. There's no doubt that that's where you really see, but probably it seems to me, in the eyes of the gospel writer, the tension between God and man.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Alex, do you want to speak?
Well, actually, I sort of what I was going to say, very much along the lines of what Dick was saying about, I suppose it raises the question as to how much of the gospel accounts of Christ's life are entirely a product of theology, and obviously, there are many different biblical scholars with different views as to how much historical or historicity there are to the gospel writers, and that's something to think about. But however much they are or not products of theology, the writers clearly wanted to portray Jesus as being torn, and I think it was easier to portray him as being much clearer about what he did or didn't stand for. But they do show someone who is very, very torn, and to me that there's a great truth in that, regardless of its historical truth. There is a great human truth in that.
No, that's helpful. Thanks. Anyone, Bridget, or anyone else who wants to speak? Bridget, have you got anything? Don't want to push you. I just thought you were looking as if you might.
It's just a thought in terms of more the sort of, how much a sort of voluntary, how much the cross was Christ's choice, and that sense is, and it's more a question than anything else. But Christ before Pilate, when Pilate was desperate to get him off, and Christ remained silent, and you think, well, that's an incredibly powerful act, because that was the moment. It's like if you're watching it like a political thriller or something, and you think, well, he's been unjustly arrested, and Pilate knows it, and you want to say to Jesus, say something, tell him this is wrong. And Christ doesn't. And you think he's already been scourged at that point, hasn't he? So he's already been horribly tortured. And so to me, that he obviously, you get Gethsemane, you get him saying, I don't want to do this. And he's obviously chosen to do it. It's not God forcing him. Because if it was God forcing him the whole time, then Pilate, the time with Pilate was the chance for him to say, this is all wrong, this shouldn't be happening. And then Pilate would have let him off, because Pilate wanted to let him off, because Pilate knew it was wrong. But Christ said nothing, and that feels very powerful.
Yeah, that's a really, interesting observation. Any further thoughts? feel free. I mean, this is really important. We caught with human language, we caught with not understanding enough about the mystery of what is going on in the cross. Christopher's quite right. We can't plummet its depths, but all we're trying to do is understand the cost of love, I think, in some ways. Love Unknown, that's the title of the book, and the freedom of love to both suffer with and also to take all that we know about our humanity and to engage with it at its greatest depth. I think that that's where I come from in terms of going with the freedom idea. But there's obviously the other side of the destiny that he's got to accept. Are we happy with that? Let's if we are, let's finish again as we normally do and take Christopher's advice and just try and reflect a little bit more on where it's at with going over that hymn again, and that's what's prompted this chapter, and then hearing it sung, and then a prayer at the end. So let me go back into the. Computer. Sometimes they're through his way, and his sweet praises sing, resounding all the day hosannas to their king. Then crucify is all their breath, and for his death they thirst and cry. This is a prayer that's at the end of the old publication of John's book. What you have is a new edition of it, but he included several prayers at the end of the chapters, and this is one that comes at the end of the chapter in his own older version. Christ our victim, whose beauty was disfigured and whose body was torn upon the cross, open wide your arms to embrace our tortured world, that we may not turn away our eyes, but abandon ourselves to your mercy. Shall we say the grace together? May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all evermore. Amen. Thank you very much. I'm going to tell you one amusing thing now that kept happening why some of the times I was actually not as consistent, not as fluent as I could be. I kept getting this sign up all the time, which I had to click to get off, and I don't think you could see it, about AI. And I can't even remember what the word said, but I thought, how odd. Here we are talking about free will and determinism, and AI keeps coming in. But I had to click something to prevent something, my agreeing to something in the computer saying, don't want it, no, don't want it now. There's something very sort of symbolic going on here, contending with AI at this point. I'm glad you didn't know, because I constantly
Yes.
having to press the go away. Not a clue why it's trying to take over the computer.
In spite of which you guided us through quite a complex chapter. Thank you, Sue.
No, well, yes, it is tough. I mean, John's got a very subtle and complex mind, and I'm trying to work out quite what is happening. I'm just going with the thing we started in the first week about the love of God and the suffering and his involvement in our humanity as being a really important part, and how often we miss that. We look at the divinity, what he's trying to do for us rather than what he's doing with us. Anyway, enough. No, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sue, very much. Thank you.
No, thank you again. And we'll talk next week is the final one. So, and I'm hoping Matthew will be doing that one. Okay, so we'll talk in church about these things more, and we'll experience them together as we go through the liturgy in Lenten Passion Week. Thanks for your contributions too. Okay,
Thank you, Sue.
See you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.